Hello, and welcome back to our continuing study of Luke. It's good to be with you again today. Today, our lesson comes from Luke, the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 11, and it's entitled Reigns, R-E-I-G-N-S, Reigns. Jesus, the subtitle tells us, prioritizes meeting people's needs over keeping rituals, which is good news for us. So that's what we will be looking at today. This week, I ask you 3 questions for you to kind of think about during the week concerning this lesson. First of all, how smart is God? How smart is God? Second, how loving is God? And how much are you willing to trust Him with all of your life's decisions? Those are 3 things I wanted you to think about. Is God the smartest one in the universe? Is He extremely loving? I think He's shown us that by His sacrifice of His Son on the cross so that we could spend eternity with Him. And now the question is, if we know how smart He is, we know how loving He is, the fact that He is love, does that cause us to be willing to trust Him with making life's decisions? And I think that this lesson is just yet another way that God has expressed His love to us by not giving us laws that are just ritualistic, but giving us laws for protection and then having His heart in them so that He's really only concerned about our good. So I hope that will cause you to think in the coming days about His great love and His willingness to do such wondrous, momentous things for us, that it will cause you to be able to trust Him just a little bit more. He is, of course, not just loving, as I said, but He is love. That's the source of all love. And He is, Jesus said, the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through Jesus. So Jesus is God in the flesh, and so we get a picture of Him through that. So we have a lot to be so thankful for. Let's look at this another way for just a moment. I've asked this question before, but let's just think about this for a moment. If God asks you to be faithful to Him and obedient to Him and to do His will for 1 second of your life, do you think you could do that? I calculated how many seconds you would have in a lifetime. The average lifetime is like 78 years, but let's assume that we expect to live longer than that, and maximum, let's say we're going to live 100 years. How many seconds of life do we have? And when I calculated, it is 3,153,600,000 seconds that you have in a lifetime if you were to live to be 100. And that's a lot of seconds. And so if God asks you out of that 3 billion seconds to just be faithful 1 second, I suspect all of us could. I think all of us could be faithful to God and obedient and godly and just do everything right for 1 second out of that long lifetime. Well, of course, God expects a little bit more than that. Once we come to Him, He expects us to commit our lives to Him. So we have to compare our lifetimes to eternity. And I can assure you that that lifetime compared to eternity is much, 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 much less than that 1 second compared to a lifetime. Eternity is never ending, and He has asked us to live these lives, but they are very, very brief. And all we have to do is just commit to living for Him, obeying Him, following His rules while we're here on this earth, to have a blessed life, not to be saved because we're saved by grace, but to be obedient and to have a life filled with peace and joy. If we can just be obedient during this lifetime, then we've got all eternity, which, as I said, by comparison is a much, much longer time than those 3 billion seconds I mentioned. In James 4:14, James addresses the brevity of life. He says, "You do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away." So by contrast to eternity, our lives are really very, very, very short, even if we live to be 100. And to live a life committed to God is a worthwhile thing in comparison to eternity. Besides this limited time that we have on this earth, this lesson shows us yet another way that God expresses his great love to us and makes it worthwhile for us to be committed to him and to obey him, and shows us why we need to be faithful to him, because he is such a loving, gracious God. We talked last time about how Jesus was often in conflict with the Pharisees, and because of their legalism, he was often debating issues with them about the law, and particularly laws relating to the Sabbath. And most of the time, the arguments were over unwritten laws, not the written laws that God had dictated to Moses, the Ten Commandments and some other things, but they had added to it, trying to identify what actually was sin. And I think their hearts were sincere. They were trying to be faithful to God, but they somehow misunderstood God's intent. They didn't have the heart to understand the law. They only knew the ritualistic part. They were only interested in carrying out the letter of the law. They did not understand now that they've met Jesus, his authority as the Son of God to forgive sins. We've talked about that. They didn't approve of his associating with tax collectors and sinners. They criticized Jesus and his disciples for not fasting, and their arguments showed that they were just so self-righteous and lacking in spiritual understanding. So Jesus was constantly having run-ins with these religious leaders. Jesus used that criticism of his lack of fasting to make the point that fasting is not an end to itself. To say that you're fasting is not something that you just get blessed for. Fasting is preparation for prayer. And whenever you have a deep grief or a longing for a need in your life, it is appropriate and proper and a good thing to spend some time fasting. But we've talked about how that just depletes your body of the food and the need for your body to be spending time digesting it and all of that's going on. And it sort of helps your mind to be a little sharper and a little bit more focused. So the fasting is in preparation for the prayer. It's not something that God's just going to bless you because you fasted for no reason. And Jesus is trying to explain this to his followers, to the religious leaders as well. So today we see another occasion when these religious leaders are criticizing Jesus because his followers are eating grain as they walk through the field. So let's take a look at the first 2 verses of chapter 6 of Luke. On the Sabbath, he passed through the grain fields. His disciples were picking heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands and eating them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus uses this occasion to teach the scribes and Pharisees and to train his followers how to handle opposition. And he's trying to make the point that he is the Lord of the Sabbath as well. Like many of Jesus' other conflicts, this event did take place on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath being primarily the 7th day. Now, the Sabbath could also be some other things. It could be the week sometimes referred to as the Day of Atonement when they had a celebration. Certain holy days were called Sabbath, but primarily it referred to the 7th day. And it was a day that God had ordained that mankind should rest one day out of the 7. And that was for our good. That is something that is very good. If anybody tries to work 7 days a week continually, he or she is going to suffer fatigue and be of no use and will lose his or her health. It is not a good thing. So God was very wise when he planned for man to have a day of respite and rest, and also to use that day as a time for worship. The Sabbath laws were, of course, included. One of them was in the Ten Commandments about keeping the Sabbath holy. So there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having a day of rest. when people refrain from work and so forth. The problem had become that these religious leaders had added to the law by trying to explain it, and it had gone beyond what God had intended. And these oral laws that the religious leaders came up with were called the Mishnah. So they were not written down for many, many years. And then around 300 AD, they were written in what was called the Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud. And then around 500 AD, there was a Babylonian Talmud created that recorded what these oral laws had said for so many years. But at the time of Jesus, they were just oral. They had not yet been written down. I think I showed you these words before. I think I'd just like to go over those again briefly with you, because these are words that keep coming up in our studies. But if you remember, we had talked about the Torah before. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. That is the books of the law. And then we have the Tanakh, which is the first 39 books of our Bible, what we call the Old Testament. And then we have the Talmud, which we're talking about today. It's divided into 2 parts. Now again, this was not written until several hundred years after Jesus, but the Mishnah was the oral laws that these religious leaders had come up with, and then they began to interpret those laws, and we have the Gemara, and that was their interpretation. Now, I am told there were about 613 oral laws when they got them all written down, so there were a bunch of laws. You think keeping the 10 Commandments was hard. These Jewish people were expected to keep not only those laws that were written, but 613 unwritten laws. There were 40 specific laws just about the Sabbath in the Mishnah, and that just made it very, very difficult on the people. The Pharisees were more interested, as I said, in the letter of the law than in any spiritual intention behind the law. Now, it was not forbidden to walk on the Sabbath, which is what Jesus and the apostles were doing here, and some of the Pharisees as well. Nor was it forbidden to walk through a field. The people of that day often did go through other people's fields, and that was not a problem as long as they didn't destroy the crop or harvest the crop or anything. So Jesus and his followers were not harming the crops, and even eating some of the grain was not forbidden, because there were no McDonald's on every corner or whatever. People were expected, even by Mosaic law, to allow those that walked through their property to eat as they went through, as long as they weren't trying to harvest the whole crop. Jesus, in this case, was not eating, but his followers were, and the Pharisees accompanying Jesus saw that, and they were very, very bent out of shape, if you will, because they saw what was going on, and they accused the disciples of doing something wrong on the Sabbath. And they accused them of like harvesting. They were just taking a few grains and rubbing them together. So they were saying, you're reaping if you're plucking them, and then we're rubbing them together, you're winnowing, which was what they did when they they threw the grain up in the air and let the air sift through it and separate the grain from the husks. And so they're saying that they are harvesting and winnowing the grain, and that's work, and that's not appropriate for the Sabbath. Some examples of some of the other extremes that these religious leaders, the rabbis, had come up with was a prohibition, for instance, against adding fresh water to flowers. That was considered sowing. Braiding hair was not allowed on the Sabbath. That was considered weaving. Walking beyond a certain distance was not allowed because the sandals would throw up little divots of dirt, and that was considered plowing. I mean, it is just so ridiculous. Separating good fruit from spoiled fruit was considered winnowing. I mean, these laws are just so ridiculous, it's hard to believe that that was what they had come up with. But they considered that to be examples of work and not appropriate on the Sabbath. If you recall, in Mark 2:27, Jesus said in another book of the Bible, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. It is something, as I said, that God gave us that was intended to be a good thing, a day of rest, but he did not intend for the legalism to kill us, and that we would not be able to barely take a breath on that day in order to rest, if you will. Some people today kind of go to an extreme with legalism and can follow some of those same practices that these religious leaders did. I remember a friend many years ago was really complaining to me one day about her neighbor on a Sunday was hammering. I don't know whether he was building something or repairing something in his house. And she said, I can't believe, he's over there just carrying on Sunday. And I thought that was ludicrous. But anyway, we still have examples of legalism going on today. So how did Jesus respond to this accusation? And that's what we're going to read in these next verses 3 through 5. Jesus answered them, haven't you read what David and those who were with him did when he was hungry? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the sacred bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. He even gave some of those who were with him. Then he told them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. When he used David as an example, he knew that the Jews revered David. They knew that he was a man after God's own heart, and they should have been very familiar with his teachings, and so they should have been familiar with this story in 1 Samuel 21 about David when he and his men were fleeing from the threat of death by King Saul, and they got, after days they had no food, they were hungry, and they stopped at the tabernacle. The temple had not yet been built, but David went into the tabernacle and asked the priest for some food. He asked for 5 loaves, and the priest said, we don't have any food. The only food we have is this food that has been set aside for God. It was 12 loaves, and it represented the 12 tribes. So the priest, Ahimelech, did give David not 5 loaves, but apparently the whole 12 loaves, which David went back outside and shared with his men. It was really only lawful for the priest to eat the bread, but this was a situation that David felt was worth breaking a few rules here because the men were so hungry. David believed that his need superseded the prohibition that was against eating that holy bread. Jesus was again making that point that Jesus himself, is the Lord of the Sabbath, that he is the Messiah, and he has a right to say what is acceptable and what is not. How can we demonstrate our acceptance of Jesus' lordship in our daily lives? He's trying to assume his lordship and make it clear to the religious leaders of that time. How do we demonstrate that we accept Jesus as Lord of our daily lives? As we talked about a little earlier, I think when we are being obedient to the laws that he's given us, when our hearts are in the right place, when we're surrendered to him, when we're willing to do things his way, even though it might not be the way that we would like to do things, but in deference to him and in our commitment to him, then we're willing for his will rather than our own. Verses 6 and 7 talk about another situation. This one takes place in the synagogue. It says, on another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue, meaning Jesus, and was teaching. A man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The scribes and Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath, so they could find a charge against him. We talked about before that Luke does not keep things in chronological order. He's just making some points here, and he's using these Sabbaths to get his point across. The time of the event takes place, as I said, in a synagogue as Jesus is teaching. The man whose hand was shriveled probably had a paralyzed hand, and it had withered from lack of use. And I'm sure it was very difficult for him to not have that hand to use, there's no indication that Jesus went to the synagogue for this specific purpose, but we know, being Jesus, that he knew he was going to encounter this man when he got there. But he went to teach, but he also knew that he would heal this man, I'm sure, when he got there. It provided him an opportunity to teach the scribes and Pharisees and to teach his followers about what was a proper activity on the Sabbath. But they were watching him closely, the Pharisees, the scribes. They were wondering if he would heal on the Sabbath, which they considered to be improper, profaning the Sabbath. They could charge him if he did. But if he didn't heal, then they could say, well, he's not the Son of God because he doesn't have the power to heal. So either way, that in their opinion, that it turned out, they were going to come up with a charge against Jesus. And once again, Jesus knew their thoughts, it says in verses 8 and 9. But he knew their thoughts and told the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand here." So the man, he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do what is good or to do what is evil, to save life or to destroy it?" So by asking, and he always asks smart questions, but by asking this question, he put them on the spot about whether they should do good or evil on the Sabbath. And he is making the man purposely stand in front of him so that they can all see, have a clear view. Either way, again, he was going to be accused. Since these religious leaders consider themselves experts on the Mosaic law, Jesus asked them, was it lawful to do good or to do evil? And that's kind of a trick question on his part as well. Was it good to save life or to destroy it? The law did allow people to take action to preserve life on the Sabbath, but obviously this man's withered hand would not have been considered a life-threatening situation. The quality of his life probably was not so good, and they weren't concerned with that. They were only concerned with the letter of the law. So what happened next? Let's look at verses 10 through 11. After looking around at them all, he told him, "Stretch out your hand." He did, and his hand was restored. They, however, were filled with rage and started discussing with one another what they might do to Jesus. Jesus looked around, but he apparently focused on the religious leaders as he healed the man's hand, again showing his authority over the healing, as he had shown over death when he raised people from the dead. The man had to have some faith to raise his hand, to be obedient, and God did perform this miracle. And we would think that the religious leaders would be excited that someone had been healed. I'm sure that any of his friends who were there were rejoicing that the man's hand had been healed. But the religious leaders, it says, were in a rage, so angry that they were out of control. This goes beyond just kind of miffed. They were really in a rage. I'd like for us to think for just a moment a situation that would happen that would be comparable in our day. Suppose we have in our church a couple, Josh and Sue. And it's Sunday morning and they're getting ready to go to church, but when they get up, they get a phone call from a neighbor. And the neighbor says, "Josh, I need you, if you can, please drive me to the hospital. I think I have broken my ankle. And my wife's in bed with the flu, and the kids are here, and I don't think I can get to the hospital. Would you drive me?" So Josh obliges and says, "I'll be glad to drive you to the hospital." Well, Sue decides that she will make a pot of soup and take it over to the wife's house for her and the children, and then she'll oversee the children until the man gets back from the hospital. Well, suppose later that afternoon, Josh and Sue get a call from a pastor or one of their deacons in their church, and he says to them, "I missed you this morning," and say Josh explains well, this is where we were. And he said, you mean you were working on the Lord's Day? You mean you were driving someone to the hospital and Sue was making soup and you missed church? I mean, that's how ridiculous it seems to us today in that situation. Would be comparable that these people were doing good, meeting a need, and yet if they were being criticized by religious leaders for doing good things, to me, that kind of tells the whole story. That wouldn't happen, certainly in our church. Nobody would do that. But that would be that case of legalism where someone has got the cart before the horse here, and they're more concerned with ritual than they are with the caring for people. Believers need to put the needs of others above rituals, just as Jesus did. Jesus always tried to explain that it was a heart issue, that he had come to bring the Holy Spirit, to lead us by the Spirit, and not to replace the law. There's some of the law that God had given was good. It was good to things that would protect us and keep us safe and be for our benefit. But it was not to follow the law just to say you followed the law. It was to have some heart in it and to be able to reason what was acceptable as well. James 1:17 says that every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Everything that God has planned for us, even his laws, have been given to protect us and for our own good. It's like the laws and rules that we come up with, for our children when we tell them not to play with fire and not to run with scissors and not to stand in the street and play and all of those things. We're giving them rules to keep them safe. And everything that God has planned for us and the rules he's given us are for our protection, because he does know everything. He does know what is best for us. He does not give us these rules to hurt us. So I think as we meditate on this lesson in the coming days, it would be good for us to remember that we have a good and loving God, and aren't we glad that he's not a mean, vengeful, evil God, that he is one who loves us and cares about us. But it's from a spiritual sense. It is from his heart. It is not from a bunch of rules that he is trying to lead us. Our time is up, and so let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for your holy word. Thank you for the examples you've shared with us that teach us that your heart is full of love, and that it is not the rules that you're concerned with, but it is for our well-being and for our caring for others that is important to you. Just make us mindful of this, Lord, in the coming days, that when we obey you and follow your rules, that we're only doing those things that as your children are proper, and that we're showing our reverence for you, that we are recognizing that you're smarter than we are, that you certainly are more loving than we are, and that you care for us so deeply. Help us to be appreciative, Lord, and not rebellious of those things that you have set in our lives to guide us. We thank you for this and all of your many blessings. In Jesus' name, amen. Next week, we'll be looking at Luke, the 7th chapter, verses 40 through 50. I look forward to being with you then. God bless. Have a great week.